Dr. Maguire is currently Keeper of Local History in the Ulster Museum. He has spent some time in the Clogher Valley, in fact on the fringes of the Clogher Valley, quite close to 5 Mile Town, where his father was one time a Methodist minister. So he has some strong connections with us. Bill is perhaps best known for his work on the Downshire estates in Ireland, that is 1801 to 1845, which basically was the published result of his doctoral thesis way back in 1972. Now, he's produced a number of important works in Ulster history over the last 25 years. But more recently, he's been interested in the history of Ulster photography. And I know this is his current ongoing research. He's already published 2 books on Ulster photographers. Many of you will be aware of his work on the Langham photographs in County Fermanagh, Heydays, Fair Days and Not So Good Old Days, which was produced by Friars Bush Press. And then his study on the photographs of Alexander Hogg, caught in time about 5-6 years ago, I think. Bill has an extensive knowledge, apart from the photographic interest, he's an extensive knowledge of Maguire Edgeworth. And we're delighted to have him with us today to speak under the title Traits and Stories of the Irish Squirearchy. Dr. Bill Maguire.
Thank you very much, Jack. Since the roof isn't too far above my head if I stand up, I will sit down and stay sitting down. Right. My title, Traits and Stories of the Irish Squirearchy, is something of a false prospectus, an echo of Carlton designed to give you the impression that there's some connection between the great Clogher-born writer and the subject of my paper. This briefly troubled my conscience, since I'm a simple historian who prefers to tell it like it is, or was, but I was reassured to note that the general theme of this summer school was to be the writer and rural Ireland. What I have to say does indeed relate to that, since it's concerned with fact and fiction in the Irish novels of Maguire Edgeworth, and is a byproduct of ongoing research into the history of one Irish rural estate, that of the Maguires of Temple, not so very far away from us here in Carlton country after all. Maguire Edgeworth's tale Castle Rackrent, I suppose the first Irish historical novel and the first regional novel in English, was published anonymously in 1800. Subtitled An Hibernian Tale Taken from Facts and from the Manners of the Irish Squires before the year 1782, Castle Rackrent began as the self-contained story of 3 generations of the Rackrent family: Sir Patrick, Sir Murtagh and Sir Kit. A 4th, Sir Connolly, or Sir Condy, who presided over the complete and absolute ruin of the family, was added later, before the novel was published. The narrator of their decline and fall is the old steward, Lady Quirk, whose memoirs the author has supposedly edited. In a central episode of the story of Sir Kit, Maguire Edgeworth tells how he quarrelled with the wealthy new wife he had recently brought home from England, because she was obstinate about surrendering her diamonds to him. Thereupon, says Lady, and this is the first in your hymn sheet, so to speak, my lady shut herself up in her own room, and my master said she might stay there with an oath. And to make sure of her, he turned the key in the door and kept it ever after in his pocket. We none of us ever saw or heard her speak for 7 years after that. He carried her dinner himself. Then his honour had a great deal of company to dine with him, and balls in the house, and was as gay and gallant and as much himself as before he was married. And at dinner he always drank my Lady Rackrent's good health, and so did the company, and he sent out always a servant with his compliments to my Lady Rackrent, and the company was drinking her ladyship's health. The country, to be sure, talked and wondered at my lady's being shut up, but nobody chose to interfere or ask any impertinent questions. For they knew my master was a man apt to give a short answer himself, and likely to call a man out for it afterwards. He was a famous shot, had killed his man before he came of age, and nobody scarce dared look at him whilst at Bath. Sir Kit's character was so well known in the county that he lived in peace and quietness ever after. The author, or editor, felt it necessary to comment upon this tale of everyday married life in Ireland in a lengthy footnote, which begins, "This part of the history of the Rackrent family can scarcely be thought credible, but in justice to honest lady, it's hoped the reader will recollect the history of the celebrated Lady Cathcart's conjugal imprisonment. The editor was acquainted with Colonel Maguire, Lady Cathcart's husband. He has lately seen and questioned the maidservant who lived with Colonel Maguire during the time of Lady Cathcart's imprisonment. Her ladyship was locked up in her own house for many years, during which period her husband was visited by the neighbouring gentry, and it was his regular custom at dinner to send his compliments to Lady Cathcart, informing her that the company had the honour to drink her ladyship's health, and begging to know whether there was anything at the table that she would like to eat. The answer was always, Lady Cathcart's compliments, and she has everything she wants." After relating the story of how the imprisoned woman saved her diamonds by throwing them out of the window to a beggar woman who used to come to the house, with instructions to deliver them to a trusted friend, the footnote goes on, "At Colonel Maguire's death, her ladyship was released. The editor, within this year, saw the gentleman who accompanied her to England after her husband's death. When she was first told of his death, she imagined that the news was not true, and that it was told only with an intention of deceiving her. At his death, she had scarcely clothes sufficient to cover her. She wore a red wig, looked scared, and her understanding seemed stupefied. She said that she scarcely knew one human creature from another. Her imprisonment lasted above 20 years." The story of Lady Cathcart's extraordinary ordeal had appeared in print a few years before Maria Edgeworth wrote the first part of Castle Rackrent. It was the publication of her obituary in the Gentleman's Magazine in August 1789 that made Lady Cathcart's long imprisonment in Ireland known to society at large. This document, which runs to about 1,000 words, is the main source of our knowledge of the woman herself and what was believed to have happened to her at the hands of her fourth husband. Elizabeth Mallon, who died in 1789 in her 98th year, nothing like exciting life to prolong it, was one of the 4 daughters of a well-to-do brewer in London. Comfortably off to start with, she increased her wealth with her first 2 marriages, both of which were childless, as indeed all her marriages were. The first was to James Fleet, son and heir of Sir John Fleet, a former Lord Mayor of London and former MP for the city. James Fleet owned the manor of Tuan Water in Hertfordshire, and when he died in 1733, this valuable property became his widow's. The second marriage to her neighbour there, Colonel Sabine, who owned an adjoining estate, was a short one and left her a still more desirable widow. So much so that she next attracted an aristocratic suitor, the Scotsman Charles Cathcart, 8th Lord Cathcart, whom she married in 1739 as his third wife. Before succeeding to the title, Cathcart had been, among other things, Governor of Londonderry and Commander-in-Chief in America and the West Indies. In 1740, not long after his marriage, he and Admiral Vernon were appointed joint leaders of the great expedition against the Spanish in the West Indies in the so-called War of Jenkins' Ear. And he died there in Dominica in December of the same year. So in fact, the third marriage lasted only about a year or so. Elizabeth Mallon was thus a widow again. Years afterwards, she told Dr. Samuel Johnson's friend Mrs. Thrale, whom she knew well and whose family had acquired her own family's brewing interests in London, that her first marriage had been to please her parents, her second for money, and her third for rank. Her fourth, to Hugh Maguire, she said, was for love. Or, as she put it later, because the devil owed her a grudge and will punish her for all her sins. At any rate, her experience did not much encourage her to fulfill the resolution she is said to have had inscribed on her wedding ring: "If I survive, I will have 5. After a courtship of some years, Maguire married her in May 1745. Sometime previously, she had purchased for him a lieutenant colonel's commission in the British Army. Although military experience in the 18th century was by no means essential for appointment to such a post, Maguire had in fact served as a captain of grenadiers in the army of the Habsburg Emperor. He resigned his commission in 1740. As it happens, we have a glimpse of him as a young wild goose. In 1736, when home on leave in Ireland, he'd come home to see his mother, he had gone armed with sword and pistols, illegal since he was a papist, to convey a challenge from his kinsman Thomas Nugent of Donore, a recent convert to Protestantism, to a Protestant JP in County Westmeath named Arthur Rochford. Rochford had arrested Nugent's servant, one Michael Malloy, said to be a papist carrying arms and a noted poacher, and had refused to release him when politely approached. After Maguire had returned to his post in Hungary, Rochford not only prosecuted Nugent for challenging his authority as a magistrate, a point in which he got the backing of the authorities in Dublin, but he also had Maguire indicted by the Westmeath grand jury for illegally bearing arms. This attempt to have Maguire outlawed in his absence apparently failed, however. Hugh Maguire was born about 1710, the third son of Brian Maguire of Temple. The Maguires of Temple had acquired their estate in the reign of James I as part of the plantation of Ulster. Unlike other branches of the family, they had managed to hold on to their property during the disturbances of the 1640s and the Cromwellian settlement, and although a later head of the family had supported James II, and the estate had been declared forfeit to the Crown after its owner's death at the Battle of Aughrim, his son Brian had recovered it in 1702. By that time, Maguire was the only Gaelic and Catholic landowner left in Fermanagh. After his death in 1712, his widow Bridget conformed to the Church of Ireland, in form at least, so as to preserve the property. Her eldest son, Cohonnet or Constantine, who died unmarried in 1739, does not appear to have conformed, but the brother who succeeded him, Robert, did so at once. So too did the third brother, Hugh, in 1743, in order to hold the colonel's commission that Lady Cathcart had fought for. At the time of their marriage, he must have been about 35 years old, his bride 53. As it happens, there is a contemporary account of the courtship and marriage from no less a pen than that of Edward Young, famous in his day, indeed for long after, as the author of one of the most popular poems in the 18th century, The Complaint, or Night Thoughts, published in 1742, who happened to be the rector of Welland, a parish in Hertfordshire adjacent to Tuam, where Lady Cathcart lived. In October 1746, Young wrote an amusing account of the affair to the Duchess of Portland in the following terms. This is number 4 on your hymn sheet. Lady C, at 59, is smitten with the gay feathers of 33, slight exaggeration, difference in age, and after a short ceremony of billing and preening, takes him into her nest. 33 finds it very well feathered. There was a young princess in the family of 18, whom 59 took from a dunghill and tossed her into a tub of soap suds, out of which she soon rose, like Venus out of the sea, the delight of her ladyship's eyes and the confidant of her heart. This Venus fell in love with Mars, that's Maguire of course, which was very happy for him, for she returned the favour she received from him with the key of her ladyship's escritoire, where he found the will, which has made him run mad. In his distraction he snatches both away to Ireland, where the young princess personates her ladyship, who was kept out of eyesight for fear of telling tales. This story of the mistress was related also in the obituary in the Gentleman's Magazine, with a good deal of circumstantial detail about the abduction. According to this source, the colonel's mistress insinuated herself into his wife so well that she learnt where her will was. Maguire, getting sight of it, insisted on her altering it in his favour, threatening to shoot her. Her apprehensions proved to be not without foundation. For one morning, when she and her caro sposo were out to take an airing from Tuin in the coach, in fact they went to church, she proposed to return, but he desired to go a little further. The coachman drove on. She remonstrated they shouldn't be back by dinner time. At length the colonel told her she might make herself easy, for they should not dine that day at Tuin. They were in the high road to Chester, and to Chester they should go. Her efforts and expostulation were vain. According to the same source, the plot then thickened. Upon her disappearing, her friends found out what had happened and whither she was gone. They sent an attorney in pursuit of her, with a writ of habeas corpus, or ne exeus regni, who overtook her at an inn at Chester. Chester, of course, was the port for embarkation for Dublin. The colonel was not deficient in expedience. The attorney found him and demanded the sight of my lady, but he didn't know her person. The colonel told him that he should see her immediately, and he would find that she was going with him to Ireland with her own free consent. The colonel persuaded a woman, whom he had properly tutored, to impersonate her. The attorney asked the supposed captive if she was going with Colonel Maguire to Ireland of her own free will. Perfectly so. Astonished at such an answer, he begged her pardon, made her a low bow, and set out again for London. The colonel thought that possibly Mr. Attorney might recover his senses, find out how he'd been deceived, and yet stop his progress. And in order to make all safe, sent 2 or 3 fellows after him with directions to plunder him of all he had, particularly his papers. They faithfully executed their commission, and when the colonel had the writ in his possession, he knew that he was safe. He then took my lady over to Ireland and kept her there in a solitary place in the country till his death, which to her great satisfaction happened in or about 1764. A later printed source corrects the date of Maguire's death, which was actually 1766, gives an account, said to have come from his wife's own mouth, of the Gothic manner of his death, and supplies some more circumstantial detail about the abduction, such as the name of the judge from whom Lady Cathcart's friends obtained the writ, and the name of the inn at Chester, the White Lion, where the attorney caught up with them. The author of this information was an English local historian, Edward Ford, who based his story largely on the 1789 obituary, but evidently did some research of his own. Among other things, he identified the place of imprisonment in Ireland as Temple in County Fermanagh, where Maguire was said to have a wild, rambling great house or castle. The room in which his unfortunate wife was shut up for above 20 years, reported Ford, was being shown to travellers in the 1870s by the then owners of the house and estate, the Emerson tenants. It still is, by their descendants, the Langhams. The room, then as now, was in the stable block, but from the evidence of a fireplace and mantelpiece, had clearly been an upstairs room in the 18th century dwelling house of the Maguires. It appears then that Maria Edgeworth, by good fortune, read the story of the wicked colonel in the Gentleman's Magazine and later adapted it for her own use. For example, by reducing the period of imprisonment from 20 years to 7, presumably in order to allow for the quick succession of rack-rent generations within the lifetime of the narrator, Lady, and by omitting or altering the details of Lady Cathcart's early life. Miss Edgeworth herself much later claimed that all the incidents in the novel were pure invention, while acknowledging a fact mentioned in a note of Lady Cathcart having been shut up by her husband in a house in this neighbourhood. She went on, "So much I knew, but the characters are totally different from what I had heard. Indeed, the real people had no resemblance at all events to my Sir Kit, and I knew nothing of Lady Cathcart but that she was fond of money and wouldn't give up her diamonds." The only character drawn from life, she said, was Thady himself, who, it's well known, was closely modelled in appearance and manner, but above all in mode of expression, on the Edgeworth family steward, John Langham. The reference in the letter I've just quoted to Maguire's house having been in this neighbourhood, that is, near Edgeworthstown, County Longford, from which the letter was sent, is the most obvious of a number of clues casting doubt on the location of Lady Cathcart's imprisonment. For the rest, the original footnote to the episode in the novel includes the claim that the author or editor of the memoirs had known the Colonel himself, had spoken to a former maidservant in his household, and had recently seen the man who escorted Lady Cathcart back to England, all of which were unlikely, if not impossible, if Fermanagh rather than Longford had been the place of incarceration. There was indeed no way in which Maria Edgeworth herself could have known Maguire, who died in 1766, long before she ever came to Ireland, or indeed before she was born. Her father, however, whose presence hovers in the background of many of her works, and with whom she shared the editorship, could have done so as a young man if Maguire had lived in Longford. And the father must have been the source of a good deal of Maria's knowledge of the manners of the Irish squires before the year 1782, as the novel's subtitle has it. My own researches into the career of Hugh Maguire not only provide the answer to the puzzle I've just outlined, but also reveal or confirm other interesting connections between historical truth and Maria Edgeworth's fiction. The fact is that Maguire did not convey his wife to his ancestral home at Temple in 1746. The house there was occupied by his elder brother Robert, who had married in 1741 Elizabeth MacDermott Roe, daughter and heiress of Henry MacDermott Roe of Kilronan, County Roscommon. Robert Maguire was to remain at Temple for many years, dying 10 years later than his brother Hugh. Nor did Hugh Maguire convey his wife to Longford in 1746. The mystery of where they went is explained by documents in the Registry of Deeds in Dublin, which show that in March 1746, in advance of his move to Ireland, and almost certainly in preparation for it, Maguire purchased the lease of a house with 500 Irish acres of land, that's about 800 statute acres, at Carra in County Fermanagh, from one Hugh Willoughby Montgomery. Now, townland of Carra lies on the border, the very border with County Monaghan, not far from the town of Clones. Here, the Maguires lived for 7 years, until the property was sold in February 1753 to Richard Dawson of Dawson's Grove. At Carra, Hugh Maguire was such an improving landlord that in 1749 he received an award from the Royal Dublin Society for planting an extraordinarily large number of trees. Many years later, in 1834, the writer of the Ordnance Survey memoir for the parish of Drummully, which includes Carra, described Carra House as an old mansion with extensive offices but much gone to decay. It has some well-grown timber about it. And the same source refers to the fine trees about the house as a pleasant exception to the general appearance of the local countryside, which consisted, he said, of flat, wet bogs with round hills or hillocks above them. In fact, the actual view from Carra House that Lady Cathcart saw must have been very similar to the fictional view from Castle Rackrent over the black swamps or bog of Alley Valley Carrico Shockland as seen by Lady Rackrent before Sir Kit's improvements had time to mature. If Maguire incarcerated his wife at Carra, there is no local recollection of it. On the contrary, what evidence there is suggests that the couple lived a pretty normal life. However little Lady Cathcart may have liked her transportation from Hertfordshire. We know, for example, from Daniel Early's Life of the famous blind harper Caroline, who incidentally had been patronised both by Hugh Maguire's father Brian and later by his elder brother Constantine, for whom the heir Planxty Maguire was composed, that Hugh Maguire and his wife visited the MacDermott Road at Greyfield in County Roscommon sometime during these years. Henry MacDermott Roe died in June 1752 at Temple, the home of his daughter and her husband, where he'd been living for some years following the death of his wife. Furthermore, Hugh Maguire, using his wife's money, and presumably with the acquiescence of her trustees, and she did have trustees, acquired a mortgage on the MacDermott Roe property, a mortgage which he foreclosed after Henry McDermott Rowe's death. In another transaction, 1748, he invested the substantial sum of £8,000 in buying up the accumulated debts on the Tempo estate in return for a mortgage. And when his younger brother Philip married in 1748, he executed a power to appoint a sum of up to £2,000 in case his wife survived him, and which her trustees, Lady Cathcart's trustees, had agreed to by an indenture dated 3rd of October 1746, that is shortly before her abduction. So, though she may have been, and presumably was, subjected to a good deal of pressure in these matters, Lady Cathcart does appear to have acquiesced, at least, in the investment of her money. Her trustees would have ensured that, should she survive her husband, she would have a legal claim to her share of the investment. Many years later, though not finally until she herself was dead and gone for 10 years, her representative succeeded in forcing Hugh Maguire's nephew and heir, another Hugh, to sell most of the ancestral estate at Tempo in order to pay off the debt. Nowhere, however, in the numerous documents generated by this legal wild goose chase is it suggested that the original contracts had been fraudulent. The Fermanagh and Roscommon estates were not the only investments Maguire made with his wife's money during these years. More to the point, so far as our present purpose is concerned, was the acquisition of a property on the borders of Longford and Westmeath. This derived, in the first instance, from the fact that Maguire's mother, who was widowed in 1712 when Brian Maguire died, and widowed a second time when she married Francis Hamilton, she was the daughter of Colonel James Nugent of Colambre, and co-heiress with her brother John and her 3 sisters of the manor of Colambre. The property was undivided, each of the parties receiving a share of the annual income, a not unusual arrangement, although in legal terms a fairly daft one. From the evidence of a series of documents in the Registry of Deeds, it appears that Hugh Maguire first acquired control of his mother's interest in Colambre and then proceeded to buy out the other parties following the death of his Uncle John in 1749. At some point, at the end of the 17th century, or the early years of the 18th century, the old castle of Colambre was apparently abandoned in favour of Castle Nugent, a property elsewhere on the estate. By paying £2,100 to each of the parties, the 3 parties concerned, Maguire acquired the whole estate for £6,300. He also spent an undisclosed sum on purchasing an additional townland in the same area. This process was complete by the summer of 1750. By 1754, he had moved house and is thereafter described in all the documents as of Castle Nugent. It was there that his mother died in 1754, an event that was noted in the Dublin press. And it was there, if anywhere, that he imprisoned his wife when she refused to disclose to him the whereabouts of the title deeds of her property in Hertfordshire or to hand over her jewels. It follows from this that her incarceration cannot have lasted for 20 years or more, not unless she was simply transferred from a room in Fermanagh to one in Longford, which is highly unlikely. At most, her ordeal lasted a mere dozen years, till her husband's death in 1766, and it may well have been less. Indeed, on the evidence available, a really sceptical historian, and one of the sort is there, could make a good case for querying whether her story was much more than the later ramblings of a very old woman who had not much enjoyed Ireland and the manners of a vanished generation of Irish gentry. Such scepticism wanes, however, when one takes into account 2 factors, namely the local knowledge that the Edgeworths had or were able to call on, and the fact that such episodes certainly did occur in other families at the time. On the first of these points, not only did Maria Edgeworth's father probably know and certainly knew of his near neighbour in Castle Nugent, very close to Edgeworth Down. But the manner of Lady Cathcart's release and her appearance, state of mind when released, were long afterwards described to the Edgeworths by one of their neighbours, John Nugent of Kilsullough, who had himself witnessed the event, and who must indeed have been a kinsman of the wicked colonel on his mother's side. On the second point, there was a much more notorious example of similar mistreatment of a wife in the neighbouring county of Westmeath. More notorious because the people concerned were prominent members of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. This was the case of Robert Rochford, Baron Belfield and first Earl of Belvedere. Rochford, in 1736, married as his second wife the 16-year-old daughter of Viscount Molesworth. They lived together at Galston, County Westmeath, the Rochford family home, and in 1738 Rochford was elevated to the peerage as Baron Belfield. All went well with the marriage until 1743, when Belfield was tipped off by the usual anonymous friend that his wife was having an affair with his brother Arthur, not only adulterous but incestuous, according to the canons. When confronted, he is said to have admitted it, and the brother fled at once to England. Instead of divorcing her, Belfield, who was promoted to an earldom in 1758, locked his wife up at Galston, where she was allowed to see only the servants, while he himself went to live at a new house he had been building 5 or 6 miles away, Belvedere Lodge near Mullingar, which is still there. There he entertained for many years in lavish bachelor fashion, lived as if he hadn't got a wife. While at Galston, his wife was confined to the grounds and not allowed to speak to anyone except the servants. After 12 years, she escaped, only to be returned at once when she turned up on her father's doorstep in Dublin. Feeling in society was very much that she deserved all she got. This is true. I mean, Mrs. Delaney's letters, for example, refer to this episode, and she says very forthrightly that more or less that she deserved all she got. So social feeling was not against the wronged husband. She was then kept more closely confined for a further 18 years until her husband died in 1774 and her son came to release her. By that time, her hair was white and she'd acquired a wild, unearthly look, just like the fictional Lady Rackrent and the real Lady Cathcart. Belvedere's guests at the lodge, incidentally, almost certainly included Hugh Maguire. At any rate, they were known to each other, for Maguire's will included instructions to his executors to pay off an unsecured loan of 130 guineas from Belvedere. Their acquaintance may have arisen from a shared hatred of Arthur Rochford, the magistrate who had tried to have Maguire outlawed, and the co-respondent brother in Lady Belvedere's adultery. There can be no doubt that Maria Edgeworth knew the story of the Belvederes. Everyone did. So it wasn't only the manners of the Irish squires before 1782 then that her tale illustrated, but also those of some of the aristocracy. The reckless career of George Robert Fitzgerald, famous fighting Fitzgerald, who was eventually hanged for his crimes in 1786, is another reminder that, as Anthony Malcolmson says in his Pursuit of the Heiress, the process of freeing late 18th century Irish social history from the image impressed upon it by Sir Jonah Barrington must not be carried too far. That comment was made in relation to a well-documented account of the attempted forcible abduction of a young heiress by a local squire's son in the town of Longford in 1772. In the fracas, which happened in broad daylight, the villain was shot and fatally wounded by a bystander. Sounds like Tombstone, Arizona. Just as Sir Kit Rackrent's mistreatment of his wife in the novel did not affect his standing among his neighbours, So too, Belvedere not only received and was received by good society, but was advanced in the peerage and appointed to important official positions. This was simply a recognition of his social and political importance. And in his lesser sphere, Maguire too found no barrier to recognition. He was a grand juror for County Westmeath and served as High Sheriff of that county. 10 years later, he stood for Parliament for County Longford, something he couldn't have attempted without friends and support. In his will, he left instructions to pay to the lawyers who attended at my election for the Knight of the Shire for the County of Longford such fees as my executors think just and reasonable. That sounds not a bad way to pay a lawyer. The fact that Hugh Maguire, the immediate model for this one episode at least, of Sir Kit Rackrent, was a Nugent of Castle Nugent is of considerable interest. For, as the critic W.J. McCormick convincingly argues, the Nugent name and family occupied a significant place in the thinking of Maria Edgeworth, particularly in her later novel The Absentee, whose heroine is Grace Nugent, and the hero, whom she will eventually marry, Lord Colambre. The fictional territory of Colambre, which is spelled Colambre in the novel, is not fictional at all, but the actual Nugent manor of Colambre, which had belonged to Maguire's maternal relatives, and most of which he had succeeded in reuniting under his own ownership. The real Grace Nugent, the Gracie Nugent of the Blind Harper's Tune in The Absentee, was the sister of John Nugent of Castle Nugent and Maguire's aunt. She had apparently lived in County Sligo with her married sister, Mrs. Conmee, and it was there that Carolan had come across her and addressed this song to her. 3 of Grace's brothers, uncles of Maguire, had been killed in the service of the Emperor in the early 18th century. She and her sisters, one of whom was Hugh Maguire's mother Bridget, were nieces of Richard Talbot, Duke of Tyrconnell, James II's Irish Viceroy. By and large, as McCormick says, the name Nugent implied an Irish, aristocratic, Jacobite background. So too, in this context, did the name Maguire. Cohonant Maguire of Temple, Hugh's grandfather, had raised a regiment of foot for King James II and had died leading it at Auckland in 1691. And 2 of his sons went to the continent after the Williamite victory. Like the Rackrents, originally O'Shaughlin's, however, though unlike them without feeling any need to anglicise their name, the Maguires of Temple had conformed to the established church in subsequent generations, at least to the extent of ensuring that they did not lose their lands or suffer the kind of social downgrading that would have ensued if the estate had been subdivided equally among heirs. The fate intended by the penal laws for landowners who remained Catholic, and evidently what actually happened to the Nugents of Colambre. Assuming that Hugh Maguire did indeed imprison his wife at Castle Nugent for several years, we have very little idea of what the castle may have looked like, or what kind of household he may have maintained there. In modern times, the building known locally as Castle Nugent House was a 19th century farmhouse of modest size and appearance. The first, it's still there, but the shell of it is still there, the modern bungalow built in front of it now. The first Ordnance Survey map of the 1830s, however, indicates alongside the farmhouse and its outbuildings the site of an earlier Castle Nugent. This building, of which only a few scattered stones, literally, now remain, was probably a tower house of the kind once common in the area. The abandoned Colambre Castle, a couple of miles away, which still survives, is a good example of the type. Many such buildings disappeared in the late 18th or early 19th centuries. Their stones used for other purposes, in this case to build the farmhouse and its outbuildings. As for the household it contained and the style of life of its owner, the only clues we have are contained in Hugh Maguire's will, a substantial document drawn up in March 1766, shortly before his death. Among the beneficiaries were his clerk, John Caulfield, to whom he left £50. His personal servant, Thomas Maguire, who got 30, Mrs. Eleanor Maguire, who also got 30, and a Mr. Nugent Crofton, a cousin, £20. These last two people are described as now at Castle Nugent, and were therefore presumably members of the household. There was also an unspecified number of servants, each of whom was to have an additional year's wage. Maguire's library of books and his gold watch were to go to his nephew Hugh, who was also the chief legatee. And I'm presuming that the library at Castle Nugent was more substantial than that of, described by Thackeray, Barry Lyndon's uncle at Castle Brady, which was said to consist of 3 books, one of which was the family Bible and a backgammon board. Like Sir Kit Rackrent, whose passing was, quote, greatly bemoaned at the Curragh, where his cattle, i.e. horses, were well known, Maguire had been the owner of racehorses. One of them, called Juba, was a winner at Down Royal in 1763, and his stud was sold by auction. The most interesting bequest, however, was to the Right Honourable Elizabeth Lady Cathcart, my wife, who was to have, quote, all the jewels and plate of which she was possessed at the time of her intermarriage with me. No hint there of years of threats, pistols to the head, imprisonment in one room. No hint either of deathbed repentance for such ill treatment, though the legacy of £50 to Surgeon Bowes of Dublin for his attendance and care of me suggests that Maguire knew his end was near. The only hint we may have of the interior of Castle Nugent comes from Lady Cathcart's own account, as reported by someone who heard her give it and later recorded by Mrs. Maitland, wife of the General. According to herself, Lady Cathcart was confined in an attic room, corresponding to the barrack room where my lady had been shut up for 7 years in the fictional tale. In 18th century Irish houses, the so-called barrack rooms were usually unfurnished attics, occasionally used to accommodate guests unfit to travel home after a party. Lady Cathcart recalled that her attic room was papered. Fortunately, because, deprived of pen, ink and paper, she devised a way of recording her thoughts by pricking the wallpaper with a pin. In time she became so adept at this that she could follow a conversation and record it. Long after her release, she astonished a visitor to Tuam, one General Cooper, by a demonstration of her skill, relaying to him on his departure every word that he had said to her. She told him that but for this occupation which I taught myself, I should have been deprived of my reason. Hugh Maguire's end, if the same source can be believed, came about in dramatic fashion. Apparently he eventually succeeded in making his wife tell him where the title deeds of Tuam Manor were, in a secret compartment with a sliding door high up in the panelling of one of the rooms of the house in Hertfordshire. Having got the information, he at once crossed to England, travelled to Tuam, and located the hiding place. Quote, the lock was stiff with the rust of 20 years, and resisted all his attempts to turn it. Too greedy and impatient to wait for a workman, or unwilling to divulge his information, he seized a large jackknife and endeavoured to force the panel. The knife slipped and cut him severely on the hand, which brought on lockjaw, and Maguire died just as he had in his grasp his long-coveted booty. Very satisfying. But of course, lockjaw or tetanus doesn't develop quite so dramatically as that suggests. And Maguire had time to arrange the lease of the property to a tenant called Joseph Steele, who was subsequently evicted by his widow, and to return to Dublin before his condition became serious and the surgeon had to be summoned. His death in April 1766 came shortly after the making of his will on the 20th of March, and was announced without any details in the Gentleman's Magazine. The will left instructions that his corpse was to be interred in the Abbey of Devenish in County Fermanagh, the traditional burying ground of his family. Quote, in a decent manner and at as moderate expense as possible, not exceeding in the whole the sum of £100, which would give you a good funeral in the 18th century. No record of the burial survives, but his wishes were presumably carried out. His two nieces were to have £300 and £200. The poor of the parish of Temple were to have 50. Those of the parishes of Granard and Street, in which his Castle Nugent estate lay, £25 each. Castle Nugent was sold by his executors and, like the fictional Castle Rackrent, passed out of the family. The art of the novelist, by which the inherent improbability of real life is transmuted into the plausibility of fiction, is normally a concern solely of literary critics. Historians, however, whose business consists of describing and analysing the real life of the past, unkind people would say, taking most of the colour and emotion out of it in the process, may legitimately consider to what extent a novel such as Castle Rackrent, which purports to represent an age already past, is true to history, as distinct from true to life. The answer in the case of Maria Edgeworth is remarkably so. Not only were what she herself claimed to be the only facts of her story historically accurate, details such as the duty fowl paid by tenants to their landlords, or the barrack rooms provided by hospitable gentry for guests too drunk to find their way home, or the sly dodges practiced at parliamentary elections, but so too were many of the episodes of her plots. The marital histories of Hugh Maguire, Sir Kit, and Lady Cathcart/Rackrent illustrate this simple point quite well. At the same time, one need not doubt the general accuracy of her recollection that the characters in Castle Rackrent were all imaginary. Even so, she went on, of course they must have been compounded of persons I had seen, or incidents I had heard, but how compounded I do not know. Not by long forethought, for I never thought of them till I began to write, and had made no sort of plan, sketch, or framework. One final observation. The process of interaction between fact and fiction operates in both directions. Fact becomes fiction, becomes fact. The factual story of Castle Nugent becomes the fictional tale of Castle Rackrent, which in turn becomes the supposed reality of Temple Manor, where there is a phantom prison room to prove it. A metamorphosis all the more plausible because the real Castle Nugent has disappeared, leaving behind no trace of reality half so convincing. In this case at least, fiction is stranger and stronger than fact. And one postscript. More generally, the subsequent history of the Temple Maguires continued to be the stuff of fiction. No one appears to have told them that bizarre behaviour among Irish squires ceased in 1782. The Colonel's nephew and heir, Hugh, in later life turned his wife, the mother of his 9 children, out of the house at Temple and lived with a housemaid. His sons Constantine and Brian were evidently brought up in traditional fashion. As boys, it is said, the authority is O'Donovan, they practiced shooting apples off each other's heads. Both did, in fact, become crack shots. Constantine became an officer in the army and married the pensioned-off mistress of the first Marquis of Abercorn, the beautiful Mrs. Hawkins. His hopes of benefiting financially from this union, however, were gravely disappointed. And when he later tried to end the marriage by challenging its validity, he was thwarted there too by Abercorn. A Temple Orangeman tried to murder him in 1829 and was hanged for it. But some disgruntled tenants on his Tipperary estate had better luck in 1834. They murdered him in brutal fashion and got away with it. His younger brother Brian, who had been provided with a commission in the army of the East India Company, was an absolutely wild man, notoriously quick to take offence, and a crack performer with sword and pistol and, on one occasion at least, billiard cue.